Okay, welcome everybody to my talk, How to Explain Spontaneous Group Actions. So the goal of the talk today is to diagnose a problem in the explanation of spontaneous group actions and to argue that in order to circumvent this problem, we need to point to something external to the agent's attitudes and their connections. So the plan of the talk is first to provide some what I take to be common sense examples of spontaneous group actions without giving any indication of what kind of theory might explain these cases. And second, I'm going to explain what I take spontaneous group actions to be. And then third is a section that I'm calling internalism and externalism. And that's where I'll really focus on the problem for spontaneous group actions. And then fourth, I merely suggest what I take the external element to be to avoid the problem. So, the first example of spontaneous group actions I'm calling the shack case. Right, so you're walking alone down a populated city street when you notice Shaquille O'Neal walking towards you. All of a sudden, Shaq falls, and due to his size, he can't get up, or even with one other person helping him. While you run to help him, another person who saw him fall runs over to help him. Right? And now, the two of you lift him up to his feet together spontaneously. The second case we'll call the protest case. Okay. On the radio, it's announced that the city council decided to quadruple property taxes, raise councilors' salaries by 75%, and to meet this evening at 6 p.m. When you hear the announcement, you decide to head to City Hall for their meeting to protest. Right? You can't afford the ridiculous tax, and the councilors don't deserve this kind of raise. At 5:30, you arrive at City Hall, and there are many others there to protest the council's decision. As it turns out, you all protest the decision together spontaneously. Now, the final case I'll cover is what I'll call the audience case, and basically I take this from Bratman in the 2014 book. So, the orchestra finishes an excellent performance. You stand and applaud the audience, and so do the other members of the audience. Or sorry, you stand and applaud the orchestra, and so do the members of the audience. You all gave the orchestra a standing ovation together spontaneously. So what are these spontaneous group actions? As a qualification, I first want to note that by group actions, I mean actions intentionally performed together by two or more people. Right? I'm not talking about the actions of self-standing groups such as governments, corporations, which might be considered to exist over and above the members of those groups. Okay. So spontaneous group actions, I think we can characterize them positively and negatively. For the positive characterization, I think that they are group actions performed by co-agents who act together immediately. Right. And the negative characterization is group actions performed by co-agents who have not engaged in any form of binding interaction. Okay, so the positive characterization, what does it mean to act together immediately? What I mean by this is that there is no mediating logical step or condition between each agent's appraisal of her situation, her legitimately intending to act together with another, and her performing her part of the group action. Right? I think when the mediating logical step will become a bit more clear once we have the negative characterization in play, but importantly here, I think how I'm using legitimately is important. Right? So to legitimately intend to act together with another, I mean to rule out coincidental matching intentions on the part of the co-agents. Right? Coincidental matching intentions would surprise co-agents upon finding out that they had the same intentions or that they were acting together, right? This just doesn't look like group action, right? So it's not the case that in spontaneous cases that people just happen to have matching intentions, include with content of the other agent or including the other agent as part of the content, and then they count as acting together. Okay. So the negative characterization, what's this binding interaction that's important in this characterization? Right? This is the interaction of the coagents that operates as a source of either interpersonal recognition or common knowledge that grounds the group action, right? Often this kind of binding interaction is what allows us to construe the group action as done together, as opposed to being, say, an instance of mutual cooperation, right? So examples of this binding interaction are, perhaps we agree to do something together, or we have mutually promised each other to do something together. We might express willingness to act together, or we might establish a coordinating plan to act together, right? This binding interaction leads to the coagents having the appropriate epistemic standing to each other, where they know, believe, etc., however you want to characterize the epistemic condition here, that they're acting together as opposed to acting individually. So what would allow us to act immediately and without binding interaction? If we don't have binding interaction, if we can't rely on binding interaction, this seems to eliminate any source for common knowledge, right? Or whatever variant of it a theory might have, right? And common knowledge is typically taken to be a central condition of theories of group action. Okay. Now, the reason why I think it eliminates the source of common knowledge is that in order to know that another person has an intention to act as part of a group, right, I need to figure out how, or I need to figure out that they have that intention, right? And this is going to involve either them expressing something to me asking them a question, them nodding, right? So there's going to be some form of interaction that constitutes our togetherness, right? So maybe, your theory depends on common knowledge. You might just want to deny that there are these kinds of spontaneous group actions, or that there are these kinds of group actions that are spontaneous, right? So to this question, I think we should stop asking a certain type of question, right? Often the question when we look at theories of group action is we think, okay, what binds these agents together such that they're acting together intentionally, right? But instead, I think we need to ask what features, excluding common knowledge, that spontaneous group actions, or that the agents have when they are actually bound together, right? So what I think this crucial feature is the coagential perspective is what I'm calling it. Right? Ultimately, I think this coagential perspective is what is going to stop us from denying that these group actions exist. So what's the coagential perspective? So when we occupy the coagential perspective, coagents can view each other as partners in an action, right? And partners is the crucial word here. It's not just viewing another as perhaps a moral agent, or perhaps as just, a person being in the way of my action, or a person who might facilitate my action, right? We're partners in action, right? And then from this perspective, you can think of your co-agent or partner's action as part of the group action that you're also acting as part of, right? Now, I don't think that this coagential perspective should be too foreign to anybody, because very many people in the literature appeal to something like what I'm calling the coagential perspective, right? At a crucial point in the text, Bratman talks about co-agents needing to treat each other as intentional co-participants. Gilbert describes group actions as conceived as partnered, right? Tomela's account of the we perspective, right? And also Roth's concept of practical intersubjectivity, right? Now, these characterizations of the perspective might be somewhat different than mine, but I think I've described what the coagential perspective in general enough terms that it's similar to those. So, a spontaneous group action, I want to claim, is a group action that can occur when co-agents legitimately occupy the coagential perspective, thereby thinking of each other as co-agents who are acting together, right? So long as we can explain why agents have this perspective and they legitimately occupy it, then I think we can explain spontaneous group actions, right? Now, we shouldn't deny the existence of spontaneous group actions if it can be explained how co-agents legitimately occupy the coagential perspective such that thoughts and actions related to the group action are warranted. Right? Now, I think that spontaneous group actions are actually special because they isolate and show most clearly this central feature of all group actions. Particularly, it is the simplest form of a theory if all we have to appeal to is this coagential perspective, right? We don't have to get bogged down in conditions of common knowledge that are often problematic, right? So I think the fact that spontaneous group actions isolate this coagential perspective, right? This actually makes them paradigmatic group actions because the coagential perspective is that crucial element of any theory of group action. So, internalism and externalism. Right? How can agents be warranted in thinking about other people as co-agents without any sort of binding interaction? Right? How can they legitimately occupy this coagential perspective? For instance, if I can't ask a person whether they're intending to act with me, how can I legitimately think of them as my partner in this action, that their action is a part of our action together, right? This seems to be a rather difficult task, given the theories that are on offer. But I think that we should take a step back and think about how these theories approach action explanation, and this might help us diagnose the problem here. So I think that most theories of group action are in the causalist camp of action explanation. Right? Actions are explained by the relevant attitudes of an agent causing her action in the right way. Right? Whether that's an intention, whether that's a belief, desire, pair, right? In following this causalist model, a theory of group action appeals to the attitudes of co-agents and the connections between those attitudes that cause the group action in the right way. Right? Now, what I want to say is, what I'm going to say doesn't argue against the causalist picture, right? So I'm not going to be promoting teleological or non-causalist picture of action explanation, but I think that this reminding ourselves about how we explain action in the causalist picture has led to a certain way of thinking about action explanation in the group case that might not apply to all the cases of group action. So I call this view that appeals to the attitudes of the co-agents and the connections between those attitudes, the internalism about group action explanation. Right, now what I want to say is that internalism fails to explain spontaneous group actions. Right? So internalism will fail because somehow co-agents must be bound together such that they legitimately occupy the coagential perspective without binding interaction. Right? The internalism can only appeal to the attitudes of coagents and their connections. The spontaneity constraint rules out any appeal to another coagent's attitudes in order to view coagents as partnered coagents, however you want to, as acting together. Right? If we can't rely on another's attitudes to warrant the coagential thoughts about her and her actions, right, and my actions as part of a group action, right, there's no other resource for the internalist to explain why an agent is warranted in thinking coagential thoughts about another. Okay. So it would be a matter of coincidence for them to have the same intentions to act together. And as I've already said, if it's just a coincidence, it doesn't really seem that they're acting together. Right? Now, I think this is exactly why common knowledge is often appealed to. Right? Common knowledge warrants these thoughts about the other and her action, right? And also my action as part of a group with this other person. Okay. The trouble is that, okay, to explain the problem again, binding interaction is going to be some form of figuring out what the other person's attitudes are, right? But if we can't interact in this way of, say, asking a person what they believe, what they intend, what they desire, right, then how we're considered to be acting together doesn't seem to be possible. Or sorry, that's badly said. It doesn't seem like the internalist has anything else to appeal to bind the agents together, unless they somehow know the attitudes of the other agents. Okay. So I think internalism seems a hopeless option for explaining spontaneous group actions. Right. I think we should turn to what I'm calling externalism about group action or group action explanation. Right. So the externalist account is the one according to which group actions are explained in part by appeal to something external to the agent's attitudes and their connections. Right. So the agent's attitudes and their connections might play a role in an externalist account, but something else outside of these attitudes is also part of the explanation. So there are two things that this external element should explain. Right? It needs to warrant the occupation of the coagential perspective with respect to another. Right? And it also has to be available to coagents without requiring binding interaction. Right? I have to somehow, each coagent has to be able to occupy this perspective without having interacted such that they know for certain that the other person is intending to do what they do, right? Because this would eliminate the spontaneous aspect of it. But somehow I have to be warranted such that we count as acting together. So the external element, my suggestion is that it is normative group reasons. Okay. A normative group reason is just a consideration for two or more people in favor of flying together. Right. So this is just basically Scanlon's description of a normative reason or a good reason, right? But in the agent variable, we have two or more people instead of one person. There's nothing in the definition of a normative reason that excludes this possibility, right? So these normative group reasons, right, they have to be there for each coagent to recognize and respond to. This will allow the coagents to not need to interact, right? And they must also be normatively public, such that each coagent ought to act with her other coagents, right? They have to be normatively public such that they rationally compel each co-agent to act on that reason. So, because normative group reasons are normative reasons, they warrant thoughts about one's co-agents and their interactions, or in their actions. Because they pick out the co-agents, group reasons put co-agents in a position to legitimately think about their group action, right? When I think, by understanding the group reason that addresses me, right? If I understand it, it addresses at least one other person too, right? So if I understand this group reason, I know that I'm not the only person picked out by it, and that I'm supposed to be acting with someone else. I'm supposed to be fying with someone else. Okay. And that's why it warrants me to think about someone else and as a partner in action and as their actions being part of our action. And because normative group reasons are normatively public, co-agents can grasp them without needing to interact with one another. Right. So this is why I characterized the positive characterization of spontaneous group actions as, when I was talking about immediacy, that the co-agents have to appraise their situation. They have to be able to move from the appraisal of their situation to their intending to act together and to doing their part of acting together. Right? So that there's going to be something in the situation that provides their normative group reasons. Right? So in the case of Shaq, it's Shaq's falling. If we both see Shaq fall, and that because he's so large, he needs two people, at least two people, to help him up, right? And we both respond to that reason, and we know that we're warranted in thinking that the other person is helping them up. So normative group reasons bind co-agents together. By warranting the occupation of the coagential perspective, thereby warranting thoughts of their co-agents and their actions as part of their group action. Acting from the attitudes derived from this perspective informed by group reasons, the co-agents can perform their parts of the group action such that the group action is spontaneously performed. Okay, thanks for watching, and I look forward to the discussion. And okay, great, thanks.